The blizzard was a living entity, a primeval breath exhaled across the tundra. It devoured the world beyond Dr. Ilara Vance's research cabin, erasing the familiar sentinel pines, swallowing the distant mountain peaks into a maelstrom of white. Inside, the roar was a constant, intimate companion, rattling the triple-paned glass, humming through the very timbers of her isolated sanctuary. For Ilara, a woman who had meticulously pared her life back to its essentials, the storm's brutal symphony was a perfect backdrop for her solitude, a natural fortress against a world she had deliberately left behind. She sat, absorbed in a dense biological text, the glow of her reading lamp an island of calm in the churning chaos. The relentless wind, the creaking of old timber, the hiss of snow against the roof, these were the only sounds she expected. Then, a sound. Not the wind. Not the groaning of ice-laden branches. A faint, desperate thump against the heavy oak of her cabin door. A sound utterly out of place. It was small. Too small for anything truly threatening. But undeniably there. Scratch. A sound of utter fragility against the brutal power outside. Ilara froze. Her hand instinctively went to the utility knife on her belt, years of fieldwork imprinting caution. Her gaze, sharp and analytical, swept the perimeter of her minimal living space, seeking an explanation in the silence between the storm's howls. She waited. The sound came again, weaker this time. A plea. Not human. Professional training kicked in. She moved with purpose, pulling on a heavy parka, grabbing a sturdy flashlight. Every instinct screamed caution. The remote north held no room for sentiment. She unlatched the heavy bolts, the cold air immediately biting at her face. The door cracked open. A blast of wind. A flurry of snow. And there. Collapsed. A small, dark mass. Barely visible against the blinding white. A tiny form, shivering violently, its legs splayed uselessly. A reindeer cub. Newborn, perhaps. Barely larger than a medium dog. Its fur, matted with ice, shimmered faintly in the beam of her flashlight. Its eyes, wide and dark, held a primal terror, a last, fading spark of life. Orphaned. Freezing. Dying. The professional detachment she had cultivated for years, a shield against all emotional incursions, threatened to shatter. But she held it. She assessed the situation. Quickly. Clinically. Survival. That was the imperative. Without another thought, she reached down, her gloved hands gentle but firm. She scooped the fragile, barely breathing creature into her arms, the cold radiating through her thick layers. Ilara bringing the fragile creature inside, her face a mask of clinical assessment hiding a flicker of shock. Ilara carried the cub directly to her workbench, usually reserved for delicate instruments and frozen samples. The cabin's warmth, though a stark contrast to the blizzard's fury, felt like a faint pulse against the cub's near-still form. She worked with practiced, clinical efficiency. Her thick gloves were shed, replaced by sterile, thin ones. A small, portable oxygen tank was quickly retrieved. She checked for frostbite on his fragile ears and nose, gently palpating his limbs. His heart, she noted, was barely a whisper. Intervention is necessary for immediate survival. Her mind, a fortress of scientific principles, recited the protocols. She warmed a small syringe of glucose solution, carefully injecting it into his scrawny flank. No habituation. She knew the rules. They were her bedrock, her professional creed. Wildlife must remain wild. She measured his temperature, wrapped him in a thermal blanket, and set a low heat lamp above him. Every movement was precise, devoid of superfluous emotion, a testament to years of training that demanded objectivity. She moved to her satellite phone, punching in the emergency frequency for the Regional Wildlife Authority. Static. A shriek of interference. The blizzard, a roaring beast outside, had swallowed all signals, severing her connection to the outside world, to the very authorities who would deem this intervention a violation. She She hung up, the deadline a cold, hard truth in her hand. The world outside, already a hostile expanse of white and wind, had now truly severed its ties. There would be no swift transfer to a wildlife rehab center, no official protocol to follow. Only her, the cabin, and the tiny, gasping life she had unwittingly welcomed. Days bled into nights, marked only by the cub's fragile breath and the rhythm of Ilara's meticulous care. Every 4 hours, she mixed a precise formula of warmed milk replacer, administering it with a slow, steady hand. She cleaned his small enclosure, monitored his temperature, checked for any sign of infection, her movements precise, almost ritualistic. The blizzard showed no signs of abating, trapping them in a desolate, shared existence. The cub remained terribly weak, a tiny flame flickering in the relentless cold, and Ilara found herself battling not just the elements, but the relentless internal monologue of scientific detachment, even as exhaustion blurred the edges of her professional resolve. One night, the cabin was hushed save for the howl of the wind and the faint suckling sounds of the cub. Ilara, bleary-eyed, held the tiny bottle, her thumb stroking the soft fur beneath his chin. He drank slowly, his small body shivering occasionally, a constant reminder of his precarious hold on life. When the last drops were gone, and the bottle withdrawn, he did not pull away. Instead, his head, still disproportionately large for his spindly neck, nudged her palm. It wasn't a search for more food. It was softer, a slow, deliberate press against her skin, seeking a warmth that transcended mere temperature. The gesture was utterly artless, pure, and devastatingly simple. Ilara froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sterile, scientific lens through which she viewed the world shattered in that infinitesimal moment. A single, unexpected tear, hot and defiant, traced a path down her cheek, cutting through the frost of her composure. "Nico," she whispered, the name a soft exhalation, unfamiliar on her tongue, yet feeling profoundly right. It was a name not of research, but of recognition, a surrender to something far deeper than data. Ilara gently stroking Nico's head, the professional barrier between them having dissolved in that one small moment. The warmth of Nico's fur beneath her hand was a grounding anchor in the sudden storm of Ilara's own emotions. That night, the fortress around her heart did not crumble entirely, but a small window had been opened. Through it, a different light began to filter in, illuminating weeks that followed in a soft, steady glow. The days blurred into a rhythm dictated by Nico's needs and the slow, steady progress of his recovery. His first wobbly steps across the cabin floor became confident bounds, his gangly legs finding their strength. He explored every nook and cranny with an insatiable curiosity, nudging at the legs of chairs, investigating the texture of the hearth rug, his small, dark eyes reflecting the flickering firelight with bright intelligence. The cabin, once a bastion of Ilara's self-imposed exile, had subtly shifted its identity. It was no longer just her space, but a shared sanctuary, filled with the quiet sounds of their coexistence, the gentle rustle of hay, the soft snuffles as Nico dreamt, the rhythmic crunch of his foraging. Ilara's dawn vigil, once a stark accounting of the external wilderness, transformed. Now, she rose not just for the data points of the migrating birds or the snow depths, but to witness the soft rise and fall of Nico's small chest as he slept curled in his pen. These were no longer strictly professional observations, they were meditative moments, a silent prayer of gratitude she hadn't known she was capable of offering. Her meticulous field journals, once filled with stark observations of predator-prey dynamics and ecological shifts, began to reflect a new, less clinical narrative. Small, almost hesitant annotations appeared amidst the scientific prose. Nico, curious, playful, seeks physical contact after feeding. Or, Nico spots fading, coat thicker, already suited for the milder days. The blizzard, once a furious white behemoth, had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world hushed beneath an impossible blanket of snow. Sunlight, sharp and cold, splintered through the cabin windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the storm's recent rain. For Ilara, the quiet was a fragile peace, a sanctuary she now shared. Then came the knock. It was firm, deliberate, entirely human. Ilara froze, her hand still resting on Nico's warm flank. She hadn't seen another soul in months, not since before Nico's arrival. Her professional guard, once lowered, snapped back into place. She moved to the door, her heart a drumbeat against her ribs, pulling it open to reveal a figure bundled in official park authority gear. Ranger Miller, a man with a kind face but an unyielding adherence to protocol, stood silhouetted against the gleaming snow. His eyes, quick and observant, scanned the interior of the cabin. They landed on Nico, nestled in his makeshift pen. Miller's expression shifted from polite inquiry to surprise, then to a more guarded, professional assessment. "Dr. Vance," he began, his voice calm, "just a post-blizzard welfare check. Looks like you've been busy." He nodded toward Nico, whose dark eyes were fixed on the newcomer. "A reindeer cub. A healthy one, at that." Ilara straightened, her posture stiff. "He was on my doorstep. Nearly frozen." Miller listened, his gaze softening briefly, but then his jaw tightened. "I understand. But the regulations are clear, Ilara. Wild animals cannot be habituated. He can't stay." He spoke of relocation, of release, of integrating the young bull into an existing herd once the snows receded. It was a matter of procedure, of ethics, of preserving the wildness of the wild. The words were delivered with empathy, but their message was a cold, hard stone. The abstract rules she'd mentally battled were no longer a distant code, they were a looming deadline, a ticking clock on their stolen time together. "I'll be back in 2 weeks to discuss the arrangements," Miller said, his tone final. After he left, the silence in the cabin felt heavier, suffocating. Ilara walked to her wall calendar, her gaze settling on the date of the ranger's return. With a steady hand, she circled it in red, a symbol of impending loss. The red circle on the calendar seemed to pulse, a raw, angry wound against the stark white page. 2 weeks. That's all the time left before the rules claimed him. The cabin, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in, pressing down on her. Ilara slid down the wall, sinking to the cold floor, the professional facade finally cracking, crumbling into dust around her. The air grew thick, heavy with ghosts. Loss. Always loss. A tiny hand, once so warm, now only a whisper against her memory. A silent room, a bassinet left empty. The impenetrable fortress she'd meticulously built around her heart, brick by painful brick, now felt impossibly fragile. She hadn't wanted to feel again, to risk this crushing ache. Not after her star. The grief, a beast she thought long caged, roared back to life, seizing her, shaking her until sobs tore from her throat, raw and uncontrolled. She buried her face in her knees, the sound muffled, desperate. A soft nudge against her arm broke through the storm of her despair. Then another, persistent and gentle. Nico, no longer the tiny, shivering bundle, but a sturdy, perceptive young reindeer, was there. He had sensed it, the profound distress emanating from her. He stepped closer, his dark eyes, so ancient and knowing, fixed on her. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head, pressing his muzzle into her lap, a quiet, solid weight of comfort. It was a mirror image of those first nights, when she had cradled his fragile body, willing him to live, to hold on. Now, he was holding her. In that profound, silent exchange, a truth resonated through her very bones, clear and undeniable as the northern stars. She hadn't just saved him from the blizzard, from the icy grip of death. She had saved herself. He was the warmth that melted the permafrost around her heart, the light that pierced the fortress of her grief. He wasn't just a research subject, he was a lifeline. He was the reason the walls had come down, the reason she could breathe again. Ilara reached out, her hands trembling, and wrapped her arms around Nico's neck, burying her face in his soft fur. Her tears, no longer born of sorrow, were of a cathartic, overwhelming gratitude. Her resolve hardened. Her duty was no longer to her profession, but to him. Her duty, now clear, was a heartbreaking paradox, to love him enough to teach him how to leave. With the park ranger's deadline ticking in the back of her mind like a frozen clock, Ilara began the painstaking, agonizing process of rewilding Nico. Their days, once spent in the quiet sanctuary of the cabin, stretched into long hours in the snow-dusted woods. She became his shadow, guiding him through the labyrinth of trees, pointing out lichen-covered rocks and the sparse winter forage beneath the drifts. She'd watch as he tentatively sniffed at a patch of frozen moss, then nudge him with her boot, encouraging him to taste, to learn, to survive without her. Every nimble step he took through the deepening snow was a victory for his wild spirit, and a fresh, cold pang for her own. He was becoming robust, his coat thicker, his movement surer, and with each sign of his burgeoning independence, Elara felt the invisible threads connecting them stretch taut, threatening to snap. One frigid afternoon, Elara brought out an old wool scarf, heavy with the scent of the park ranger who had visited weeks ago. The scent was alien, distinctly human, but not her human. Nico, curious, approached it. Elara's voice, usually a soft murmur, was firm, almost harsh. She shooed him away, pushing him back with a sharp, unfamiliar gesture. He flinched, confused, his dark eyes wide with a flicker of betrayal. It was a cruel lesson, teaching him caution against her own kind, a necessary deception that made her stomach churn. She was building a wall between him and the very species that had saved him, a species that included her. It was a calculated cruelty, enacted out of the purest love, and each instance left a bitter taste in her mouth, a profound ache in her chest. The cabin, once a haven, began to feel like a cage for both of them. Nico would stand at the window, staring at the forest, his ears swiveling, sensing the calls of a world he was meant to inhabit. Elara's heart swelled with fierce pride as he grew stronger, as his innate instincts sharpened, but that pride was always underscored by a deep, aching sadness. Every successful foraging attempt, every hesitant step he took further from her side, was a bittersweet victory, a countdown to their inevitable separation. His growing wildness was a mirror reflecting her deepening sorrow. Nico looking back at her from the edge of the woods, a wild creature testing his boundaries, and Elara watching with a heavy heart. Weeks later, as late December shrouded the world in a profound, crystalline silence, the weight in Elara's chest had grown almost unbearable. The ranger's deadline loomed, a stark, unyielding presence on her mental calendar, and every moment felt charged with the bitter knowledge of impending farewell. Outside, the world was transforming under a different kind of storm. Not the raging fury that had once delivered Nico to her door, but a heavy, silent snow that fell with an almost liturgical grace. It gathered on every branch, every rock, every pane of glass, creating a landscape of hushed white curves and soft, ethereal light. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, hushed and expectant, as if waiting for a revelation. One afternoon, as the cabin settled into the deepening twilight of a short winter day, Nico grew strangely agitated. His head lifted, his ears swiveling with an acute sensitivity Elara had rarely witnessed. He paced the small perimeter of his temporary enclosure, not with his usual playful energy, but with a taut, almost frantic focus. He stopped abruptly at the window, pressing his nose to the cold glass, his dark eyes fixed intently on the distant ridgeline, barely visible through the falling flakes. Elara, her scientific curiosity momentarily eclipsing her anxiety, followed his unwavering gaze. The snow continued its gentle descent, a veil drawing across the vast canvas of the northern wilderness. For a long moment, there was nothing but the hypnotic dance of white against the darkening grey sky. Then, a flicker. A movement that resolved itself not into a trick of the light, but into a distinct, living form. And then another, and another. Through the persistent, swirling curtain of snow, a herd of wild reindeer appeared, their outlines soft and indistinct at first, then coalescing into a magnificent procession. They moved with an ancient, unhurried rhythm along the highest ridge, a rare, almost magical sight in the deepening twilight. A path home had appeared, woven from instinct and the wild heart of the land itself. Elara and Nico stood at the window, side by side, watching the herd. The miracle isn't that they appeared, the miracle is the choice they offer. The decision, once a distant echo of duty, now solidified into an unyielding clarity. It was the hardest choice, and the only choice. Elara moved with a quiet purpose that belied the turmoil within. She found her heavy coat, her movements precise, almost ritualistic, as she shrugged it on. She didn't look at Nico, knowing that one glance might shatter her resolve. The cold air rushed in as she unlatched the heavy timber door. No lead, no restraint, simply an open invitation to the vast, white world. Nico, sensing the shift in the air, the gravity of the moment, moved from the window and followed her out into the hushed expanse of snow. The journey to the ridge felt impossibly long, yet too short. Each step crunched softly, the only sound in the profound silence of the winter wilderness. They walked side by side, no longer keeper and kept, but companions on a final, shared path. The snow-laden trees stood like silent sentinels, witnessing their pilgrimage. At the edge of her clearing, where the domesticated world met the wild, Ilara stopped. She knelt in the deep snow, the cold seeping through her thick trousers, but she barely felt it. Her eyes, brimming with unshed tears, met Nico's ancient, dark gaze. No words were spoken, none were needed. It was a language of shared moments, of a life saved and a heart restored. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently touched his soft muzzle one last time, feeling the warmth of his breath against her palm. Nico stood still, his ears swiveling, sensing the faint, distant calls of the herd. He looked from Ilara to the welcoming silhouette of the cabin, then back to her, a brief, poignant hesitation. A profound understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of their improbable journey. Then, with a turn of his head, he took a step, then another. He walked confidently, powerfully, toward the distant ridge, toward his own kind. He merged effortlessly into the moving mass of bodies, a new addition to an ancient rhythm, accepted without a backward glance. Ilara stood alone in the snow, watching until the herd disappeared over the ridge, leaving only tracks behind. The next winter arrived, a familiar tapestry of white and silence, but Ilara Vance was no longer the woman it had once cloaked in isolation. Her cabin still stood sentinel against the vast northern expanse, yet the hermetic seal around her own heart had fractured and dissolved. Days were no longer spent solely within the confines of her research. She now exchanged easy, if still understated, greetings with the regional park ranger, Mark, during his infrequent checks, sharing updates on wildlife patterns or a knowing nod about the season's temper. She had become, through the impossible connection forged on her doorstep, a quiet fixture in the sparse human tapestry of the region. Her new ritual began as the sun started its slow arc across the frigid sky. A thermos of steaming tea, her binoculars, and a quiet determination guided her steps to a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley, a vantage point that offered a sweeping vista of the frosted wilderness, a place where the wild heart of the land beat visibly. She would sit, sometimes for hours, lost not in grief, but in contemplation, in a patient communion with the landscape. Today, the world was a canvas of muted whites and greys, the air crisp and still enough to carry the whisper of a distant gust. She raised the binoculars, scanning the familiar tree lines, the snow-laden slopes where shadows lengthened like ink spilled on parchment. Her breath hitched. There, moving with the rhythmic grace of their kind, was a herd. She tracked them, her gaze seeking, until she found him. Not a cub, but a robust young bull, his velvet antlers just beginning to unfurl in majestic promise, his coat thick and rich. He foraged with the others, a natural part of the ancient cycle. Then, as if sensing the unseen gaze, he lifted his head. His dark, intelligent eyes, ancient as the tundra itself, found her, across the vast, silent wilderness. He paused, a moment suspended in the frigid air, a silent acknowledgement, deep and profound, a bond that transcended distance and difference. Ilara lowering her binoculars, a serene and grateful smile on her face, before turning to head home.